At 5:40 in the evening on July 1st, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt picked up the telephone in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a grand chateau just west of Paris that had once belonged to French royalty. The evening light filtered through tall windows onto maps covered with red and blue markings showing the disposition of forces across Normandy. On the other end of the line was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, calling from the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters, hidden in the forests of East Prussia, over 1,000 miles away. Keitel wanted to know what the situation was in Normandy. His voice carried the nervous tension of a man who would have to relay whatever answer he received to a leader increasingly detached from military reality. 25 days had passed since the Allied landings on June 6. The Americans had just captured Cherbourg, the deep-water port that would soon allow them to pour supplies into France at an industrial pace. The British were grinding toward Köln, the key city that controlled the road network into the French interior. German casualties were staggering. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. The equivalent of multiple divisions had simply ceased to exist. Replacements were not coming. The Luftwaffe could not contest the skies. The front was crumbling inch by inch, day by day. Keitel asked the question that Hitler had been demanding an answer to for weeks. What should we do? Von Rundstedt paused. The line crackled with static. He was 68 years old, the senior field marshal in the German army, a professional soldier who had served the German state for over 50 years under 3 different governments. He had commanded the conquest of Poland in 35 days. He had led Army Group South through Ukraine in 1941, covering 400 miles in 3 months. He had overseen the defense of Western Europe since 1942. He had studied war his entire adult life. He knew exactly what needed to be done. "End the war, you idiots," he said. "What else can you do?" The line went silent. Keitel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Von Rundstedt had spoken the truth that everyone in the German High Command knew, but no one dared articulate. The war was lost. Continuing to fight would only determine how completely Germany would be destroyed before the inevitable surrender. Within days, von Rundstedt was relieved of command. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, a capable officer who would prove no more able to reverse the situation than von Rundstedt had been. The war would continue for another 10 months. Millions more would die. German cities would be reduced to rubble. The Red Army would fight its way to Berlin, exacting a terrible revenge for the horrors Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. And the man who had seen the truth, spoken it plainly, and been removed for his honesty, would watch from retirement as everything he predicted came to pass, exactly as he had foreseen. What happened in those 25 days between D-Day and that phone call reveals something profound about how military organizations fail when honesty becomes punishable. It shows what happens when the men at the top refuse to listen to the men who can actually see the battlefield, and it demonstrates a truth that applies far beyond warfare. The people closest to a problem often understand it best, but the people farthest from it often have the most power to ignore them, and the most incentive to do so. To understand why von Rundstedt said what he said, and why it cost him his command, you have to understand what he had been watching since the spring of 1944, and what kind of man he was. Gerd von Rundstedt was born on December 12, 1875, in Aschersleben, a small town in Prussian Saxony. His family had produced officers for the Prussian and German states for generations. Military service was not a career choice for the von Rundstedts. It was a family tradition, an obligation of class, an identity. His father had served as a lieutenant in the Hussars, and later rose to the rank of general. His grandfather had fought against Napoleon. The expectation that young Gerd would become an officer was as natural as the expectation that he would learn to read. He entered the German army as a cadet in March 1892 at age 16. By 1914, when the Great War began, he was a captain serving on the staff of an army corps. He spent the war in staff positions, learning the art of moving large formations, coordinating artillery and infantry, managing the logistics that determined whether armies advanced or starved. He never achieved fame as a frontline commander, but he developed a reputation for methodical competence, clear thinking, and an ability to remain calm when situations deteriorated. After Germany's defeat in 1918, von Rundstedt stayed in the small professional army that the Versailles Treaty permitted Germany to maintain. He rose steadily through the ranks. By 1932, he commanded a cavalry division. By 1936, he was one of the most senior generals in the German military. When Hitler came to power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already an established figure, a representative of the old Prussian military aristocracy that predated the Nazi movement by centuries. Von Rundstedt was not a Nazi. He never joined the party. He never expressed enthusiasm for National Socialist ideology. He viewed Hitler with a mixture of professional distance and aristocratic contempt. Among fellow officers, he called Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, a reference to Hitler's modest rank in the Great War and his Austrian origins. Von Rundstedt considered himself a soldier of Germany, not a soldier of any political movement. His loyalty was to the state, to the army, to the traditions of Prussian military service. Politicians came and went. The army endured. But von Rundstedt was also a man of his time and class, which meant he was willing to serve whoever controlled the German state, regardless of their methods or goals. When Hitler launched the war, von Rundstedt fought it. He did not question whether the war was just. He did not resign in protest when Germany invaded Poland, a country with which Germany had signed a non-aggression pact only months earlier. He simply did his job, and he was brilliant at it. His campaign in Poland in September 1939 was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. He commanded Army Group South, driving from Silesia toward Warsaw with speed and precision. His forces covered 200 miles in 2 weeks, encircling Polish armies and preventing them from establishing coherent defensive lines. The campaign was over in 35 days. Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. In May 1940, von Rundstedt led Army Group A in the invasion of France. His forces made the crucial thrust through the Ardennes, the forested highlands of Belgium and Luxembourg that French planners had dismissed as impassable to tanks. 7 panzer divisions drove through the narrow roads and emerged behind the main French defensive positions. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered. It was the greatest German military victory since the Wars of Unification in the 19th century. In June 1941, von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces drove through Ukraine, covering 400 miles in 3 months, capturing Kiev in one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the Kiev pocket alone. Von Rundstedt's reputation as one of Germany's finest commanders was secure, but von Rundstedt also saw something that the ideologues in Berlin refused to see. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, was not surrendering. New divisions appeared to replace those destroyed. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, continued to produce tanks and aircraft. The winter of 1941 brought the German advance to a halt outside Moscow. The quick victory Hitler had promised was not coming. In December 1941, von Rundstedt ordered a withdrawal from Rostov, a city in southern Russia that his forces could no longer hold. Hitler was furious. He had forbidden any retreats. Von Rundstedt offered his resignation, and Hitler accepted it. For the first time, the field marshal learned what happened to commanders who told Hitler things he did not want to hear. But Germany needed von Rundstedt. In March 1942, Hitler recalled him and appointed him Commander-in-Chief West. His job was to prepare the defense of the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, nearly 3,000 miles of coastline. The Allies would eventually invade. Everyone knew it. The question was where and when, and whether Germany could defeat the invasion when it came. Von Rundstedt commanded dozens of divisions on paper. In reality, many were under strength, undertrained, or filled with soldiers who had no business being on a front line. Some divisions consisted primarily of older men, conscripted in their 40s after younger men had been killed or captured in the east. Other divisions contained Osttruppen, soldiers from the conquered territories of the Soviet Union who had volunteered or been coerced into German service. Their reliability was questionable. Their equipment was often obsolete. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. Allied bombers struck German industry by day and by night, and the fighter forces that tried to stop them were being ground down in a battle of attrition they could not win. The Kriegsmarine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats still sailed, but they were being sunk faster than they could be built, and the convoy routes bringing American men and material to Britain were flowing freely. Von Rundstedt was being asked to hold a continent with an army that was already bleeding to death in the east against enemies who controlled the sea and the sky, with no prospect of reinforcement and no margin for error. He understood the mathematics of the situation. He understood that Germany's strategic position was deteriorating every month, but he was a soldier, and soldiers do their duty. He would prepare the best defense he could and hope that circumstances might change. The fundamental problem was resources. Germany did not have enough men, enough tanks, enough aircraft, or enough fuel to defend everywhere at once. The Atlantic coast stretched for thousands of miles. The Allies could land almost anywhere. Decisions had to be made. Priorities had to be set. Forces had to be concentrated at the most likely invasion sites, while accepting risk elsewhere. And this is where the conflict began. Von Rundstedt wanted to hold his panzer divisions in reserve, positioned well back from the coast, perhaps 100 miles inland. His reasoning was classical military doctrine. You cannot be strong everywhere, so you wait until the enemy commits himself, then mass your strength at the decisive point and counterattack. The panzer reserves would be the hammer that would smash the Allied beachhead once its location was confirmed. Trying to spread armour along the entire coast would make it too weak everywhere to be decisive anywhere. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been appointed to command Army Group B under von Rundstedt in November 1943, disagreed completely. Rommel had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He knew what Allied air power could do. He had watched his supply convoys burn on the desert roads to Tobruk. He had seen his tanks destroyed by fighter bombers before they could reach the battlefield. He had experienced the devastating effects of naval gunfire on coastal positions. Rommel believed that once the Allies established themselves ashore, German armour would never reach the coast. Allied fighter bombers would destroy the panzers on the roads. Allied naval guns would shatter any counterattack that approached the beaches. The only chance, Rommel argued, was to defeat the invasion in the first hours, on the beaches, before the Allies could consolidate their position. Every tank, every gun, every soldier had to be as close to the water as possible. The invasion had to be stopped at the waterline or it would not be stopped at all. Rommel famously told his staff that the first 24 hours would be decisive. For the Allies as well as Germany, it would be the longest day. Both men had valid points. Von Rundstedt's classical approach had worked throughout military history. Rommel's assessment of Allied air and naval power was accurate. A compromise might have worked better than either approach alone. But Hitler, characteristically, chose the worst possible option. He compromised by keeping direct control of key panzer divisions himself. The Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. This decision removed strategic flexibility from the commanders on the ground. It meant that when the invasion came, the men who could see what was happening would have to ask permission from a man 1,000 miles away who could not see anything at all. It meant delays. It meant confusion. It meant that the critical hours after the landing would be wasted waiting for authorization that might or might not come. June 6, 1944, D-Day, 0 hour. The Allies landed on 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. At Utah Beach, the American 4th Infantry Division came ashore with relatively light casualties. At Omaha Beach, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions ran into the German 352nd Infantry Division and suffered terribly, with over 2,000 killed and wounded in the first hours. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces established themselves against determined but ultimately insufficient resistance. 156,000 men came ashore on the first day. 11,000 aircraft supported them, maintaining complete control of the skies over the invasion area. Nearly 7,000 ships delivered them, the largest naval armada ever assembled. Over 23,000 airborne troops, including 13,000 American paratroopers, had jumped or landed by glider behind the German lines during the night, seizing key bridges and road junctions, creating chaos in the German rear areas. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Von Rundstedt learned of the landings around 6:30 in the morning, when reports began filtering in from the coastal defense units. Paratroopers had been landing for hours. Naval bombardment had begun before dawn. The scope of the attack was immediately clear. This was not a raid. This was the invasion. Von Rundstedt immediately requested the release of the panzer reserves. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division were positioned to counterattack if given permission to move. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their beachheads. Every hour mattered. The request went to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof in Bavaria, where he had been staying since late spring. He had stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning watching newsreels with Goebbels and Eva Braun. His personal physician had given him a sleeping pill to treat his chronic insomnia. His staff, terrified of his rages, refused to wake him. The Führer had left explicit orders not to be disturbed. Even Albert Speer, the armaments minister, who arrived at the Berghof around 10 in the morning, found Hitler still asleep. The panzers sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews waiting for orders that did not come. Hours passed. The Allies consolidated their positions. More men and more equipment came ashore. The beachheads linked up. The window for a decisive counterattack began to close. When Hitler finally woke around noon, he still hesitated. He was convinced that Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from the British coast. Allied deception operations, codenamed Fortitude, had convinced German intelligence that a massive army group under General George Patton was waiting in southeast England to strike at Calais. The entire Normandy operation, Hitler believed, was designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective. Hitler refused to release the panzer reserves until he was certain. He kept them in place, waiting for an attack on Calais that would never come. The deception was so effective that Hitler continued to believe in the Phantom Army for weeks after D-Day, holding back forces that could have been committed in Normandy. By the time the panzers finally received authorization to move in the late afternoon, around 4 in the afternoon, Allied aircraft were waiting. Columns of tanks and trucks moving on French roads by daylight were easy targets. Fighter bombers struck again and again, destroying vehicles, blocking roads, creating chaos. What should have been a rapid deployment became a grinding ordeal. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured unit close enough to counterattack on D-Day, launched a disjointed attack that evening. One battle group actually reached the coast between the British beaches, but it was too weak to exploit the penetration. By nightfall, it had withdrawn after losing 70 of its 124 tanks. The moment to throw the Allies back into the sea had passed. It would never return. Von Rundstedt watched this unfold with growing despair. Every hour that passed allowed the Allies to land more men, more tanks, more artillery. Every hour allowed them to strengthen defensive positions and bring forward additional supplies. Every hour reduced Germany's chances of victory, and there was nothing he could do about it. The decisions were being made in Bavaria by a man who had never commanded troops in battle, who refused to visit the front, who relied on coloured pins on a map to understand situations that could only be grasped by seeing them firsthand. The first week after D-Day confirmed von Rundstedt's worst fears. The Allies were not going to be pushed back. They were establishing themselves, building up their forces, preparing to break out into the French interior. German counterattacks failed one after another. The 12th SS Panzer Division, when it finally arrived, launched attacks that caused heavy Allied casualties, but failed to dislodge the beachhead. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best-equipped armoured formations, was fed into the fighting piecemeal and began to suffer losses it could never replace. Reinforcements were delayed by Allied air attacks on French railways and bridges. The systematic destruction of the French rail network had been underway for months before D-Day. Now its effects were fully felt. Divisions that should have reached Normandy in days took weeks. The French resistance added to the chaos, cutting telephone lines, ambushing convoys, providing intelligence to Allied forces. The front was stabilizing, but it was stabilizing in favor of the enemy. On June 17th, 11 days after the landing, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler at Margewal, a command bunker complex near Soissons known as Wolfsschlucht II that had been built in 1940 for the planned invasion of Britain. It was the only time Hitler would ever use this facility. It was also the first time Hitler had been to France since the armistice in 1940. He had refused to visit the front despite repeated requests from his commanders. Now he came, but only to a bunker far behind the lines, protected by layers of security. He had flown from Berchtesgaden to Metz the previous day, then travelled by motorcade overnight. Hitler arrived looking pale and exhausted, his hands trembling visibly. He walked with a stoop. His famous energy had given way to a nervous agitation that alarmed the officers who saw him. Later, it would be understood that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, though at the time the symptoms were attributed to stress and overwork. Rommel spoke first. He described the situation with brutal honesty. The front was barely holding. Casualties were running at 2,500 men per day, and replacements were arriving at a rate of perhaps 1,000. The Allies had complete air superiority. German soldiers could not move, could not resupply, could not reinforce in daylight without being attacked from the air. Every day, the Allied build-up grew stronger, while German strength diminished. The mathematics of the situation were undeniable. Unless something changed dramatically, the front would eventually collapse. Rommel urged Hitler to consider the political implications. If the war in the West could not be won militarily, perhaps a diplomatic solution should be sought. Perhaps negotiations might preserve something of Germany's position before total collapse made any negotiation impossible. Hitler erupted. He accused Rommel of defeatism, of lacking faith, of failing to understand the situation. He insisted that new weapons would turn the tide. The V-1 flying bombs had just begun hitting London. V-2 rockets would follow. Jets would sweep the Allied bombers from the sky. Wonder weapons would change everything. Hitler demanded that the troops fight for every inch of ground. No retreats, no withdrawals. Every position would be held to the last man. Will would overcome material disadvantage. Belief would conquer arithmetic. He ordered Cherbourg held at all costs. The conference ended abruptly when a stray V-1 rocket fell nearby, sending everyone scrambling for cover. Von Rundstedt said little during the conference. He had learned that arguing with Hitler was pointless. The Führer did not respond to reasoned analysis. He responded to his own intuitions, his own beliefs, his own conviction that he understood war better than the professionals who had studied it their entire lives. Von Rundstedt later assessed that the discussion had no success. The man who had once made bold, decisive gambles based on accurate assessments of enemy weakness was now clinging to fantasies about miracle weapons and unshakable determination. The meeting ended without resolution. No strategic change was authorized. The orders remained the same. Hold everywhere. Counterattack when possible. Wait for the wonder weapons. Have faith. Von Rundstedt and Rommel returned to France, knowing they had failed to change anything. They had presented the facts. They had explained the situation. They had been ignored. Both men now understood that the war would continue until Germany was utterly defeated, because the man in charge would not permit any other outcome. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the following days. On June 18th, American forces cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, isolating the fortress of Cherbourg with its vital port facilities. Hitler ordered the garrison to hold to the last man. They fought with determination, but determination could not stop American artillery and infantry. The city fell on June 26th and 27th. After desperate fighting, the garrison commander surrendered. The harbour fortifications held out until June 29th before finally capitulating. American engineers soon had the port partially operational. Within months, it would be handling 14,000 tons of supplies per day. Meanwhile, the British were grinding toward Caen, the key city that General Bernard Montgomery had hoped to capture on D-Day itself. 3 weeks after the landing, Caen was still in German hands, but the battle for it was consuming the German armoured reserve at an unsustainable rate. Operation Epsom, launched on June 26th, pushed the British to within 2 miles of the city before being halted by desperate German resistance. But halting the British offensive cost Germany tanks and trained crews it could never replace. The panzer divisions that von Rundstedt had wanted to hold for mobile operations were being ground down in static defensive fighting. Every day, dozens of tanks were destroyed by naval gunfire, by artillery, by fighter bombers, by Allied armour. Every day, veteran crews who had taken years to train were killed or wounded. The German army in the west was bleeding to death, holding ground that would eventually be lost anyway. Von Rundstedt understood this. Rommel understood this. The commanders on the ground understood this. Only Hitler refused to understand. On June 29th, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler again, this time at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. They flew from France to Germany, a journey of several hours, leaving the crumbling front behind. The fact that the field marshals had to travel 1,000 miles to speak with their commander said everything about the dysfunction of German command arrangements. Rommel again laid out the situation in terms that could not be misunderstood. "The front cannot hold indefinitely," he said. "The troops are fighting bravely, but they cannot fight tanks with rifles. They cannot stop aircraft with machine guns. Every day we lose ground we cannot retake. The Allies grow stronger while we grow weaker. The only question is whether we lose the war slowly or quickly, whether we spend our entire army holding worthless territory or preserve it for a defense that might actually succeed." Hitler responded with familiar arguments. New divisions would arrive. Wonder weapons would devastate England. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would collapse from its internal contradictions. The Western democracies would lose their will to fight when casualties mounted. Germany only needed to hold on until the tide turned. Von Rundstedt finally spoke. He had listened to these arguments for months. He had watched them fail to correspond with reality for months. He was tired of polite professional discourse that changed nothing. "The war in the West is lost," he said. "Not losing, but lost. The question is not whether Germany will be defeated, but when and at what cost. Every day, the war continues. More German soldiers die for nothing. Every day brings more destruction to German cities. The only rational course is to seek an end to the fighting before Germany is utterly destroyed, before there is nothing left to save." Hitler stared at him. The room fell silent. Other officers looked at the floor, unwilling to be associated with such dangerous candor. Then Hitler began to speak, his voice rising in fury. He accused von Rundstedt of cowardice, of defeatism, of betraying the German people and the soldiers fighting at the front. He insisted that victory was still possible if only the generals would believe in it, if only they would fight with the determination he demanded. The meeting ended without resolution. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. Von Rundstedt and Rommel flew back to France, knowing that they had spoken the truth and been rejected for speaking it. 2 days later, on July 1st, 1944, came the telephone call from Keitel. The immediate trigger was the collapse of defensive positions around Cherbourg and the deteriorating situation on the Cotentin Peninsula. That afternoon, the German High Command had countermanded von Rundstedt's orders, allowing armoured units to withdraw from Allied naval gunfire range near Caen. Keitel, speaking for Hitler, wanted to know what should be done to stabilise the front. Von Rundstedt had no patience left for the charade. He had been warning for weeks. He had been ignored for weeks. He had watched good soldiers die for weeks in a cause that was already lost. When Keitel asked what should be done, von Rundstedt answered with the only honest response left. "End the war, you idiots." What else can you do? The words were not diplomatic. They were not couched in the careful language that generals used when addressing political leadership. They were not softened with qualifications or hedged with alternative interpretations. They were blunt, direct, and devastating. And they ended von Rundstedt's command. Hitler's response came swiftly. The next day, July 2nd, Hitler issued the dismissal order. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge was summoned to take over as Commander-in-Chief West. Von Rundstedt was told to go home and await further orders. The official announcement attributed his departure to age and ill health. There was no court-martial, no public disgrace, no dramatic confrontation. Hitler still needed the appearance of support from the old Prussian military aristocracy. still needed the prestige that officers like von Rundstedt brought to the regime. But von Rundstedt's active career appeared to be over. He had spoken the truth, and truth was not tolerated. What followed proved every word von Rundstedt had spoken to be accurate. Von Kluge arrived confident that he could succeed where von Rundstedt had failed. He had commanded successfully on the Eastern Front. He believed the situation in the West could be stabilized if it was handled properly. Within days, he understood the reality. The situation was exactly as bad as von Rundstedt had described, perhaps worse. The Allies were not going to be stopped. On July 20th, 1944, less than 3 weeks after von Rundstedt's dismissal, a group of German military officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a briefcase and placed it under a conference table at the Wolf's Lair during a briefing with Hitler. The bomb exploded at 12:42 in the afternoon, killing 4 people and wounding many others. But Hitler survived. A heavy oak table had shielded him from the worst of the blast. He emerged with burst eardrums, burns, and wounds from wooden splinters, but very much alive. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. The conspirators had assumed Hitler was dead and began implementing their plan to seize power, codenamed Operation Valkyrie. When news came that Hitler had survived, the coup fell apart. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed. Stauffenberg was shot by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bendler block shortly after midnight, shouting, "Long live sacred Germany," with his last breath. Others were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. Thousands more were arrested in the purge that followed, as the Gestapo rounded up anyone connected, however tenuously, to the resistance. Nearly 5,000 people would eventually be executed in connection with the plot. Rommel was implicated in the conspiracy. He had known about the plot and had not reported it. Some evidence suggested he had been more actively involved, though he denied this under interrogation. The evidence against him was strong enough that Hitler could not ignore it, but Rommel was too popular to put on trial. His victories in North Africa had made him a national hero. A public trial would reveal that Germany's most famous general had turned against the regime. Rommel was offered a choice. He could face the People's Court, where conviction and execution were certain, and where his family would face persecution afterward. Or he could take poison and die as a hero, with his family protected and his reputation preserved. The state would announce that he had died of his wounds from an earlier strafing attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honours. On October 14th, 1944, 2 generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen with the poison. Rommel had been recovering from wounds suffered when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft in July. He told his wife Lucy and his son Manfred what was about to happen. He said goodbye to them, walked to the waiting car, and swallowed the cyanide capsule. He was 52 years old. The man who had understood the situation in Normandy better than almost anyone, who had urged Hitler to seek peace while there was still something to negotiate, was dead because he had been right. The state funeral that followed presented him as a hero who had died of his wounds. Von Kluge fared no better. In early August, the American breakout at St. Lo shattered the German front. Operation Cobra punched through German lines and poured into the French interior. Von Kluge ordered a counterattack at Mortain that Hitler had demanded. Even though von Kluge knew it was hopeless, the counterattack failed. The German forces were nearly encircled at Falaise as American and British forces closed a trap around them. Over 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the Falaise pocket. The German 7th Army ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. When Hitler suspected von Kluge of attempting to negotiate with the Allies, he was recalled to Berlin. On August 19, 1944, on the road back to Germany near Metz, von Kluge pulled his car to the side of the road and swallowed cyanide. He was 61 years old. He left a letter to Hitler, urging him to show the greatness needed to end a hopeless struggle. The letter changed nothing. The pattern was unmistakable. Every senior commander who saw the truth and spoke it was destroyed. Hitler surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear, and he destroyed the men who told him what he needed to hear. The system punished honesty and rewarded delusion. It guaranteed its own failure. Meanwhile, the military situation collapsed exactly as von Rundstedt had predicted. Paris fell on August 25, 1944, liberated by French forces with American support. By September, the Allies were at the German border. The Netherlands, Belgium, and most of France had been liberated. The Wehrmacht in the West had lost over 400,000 men since D-Day. The war that von Rundstedt had said was lost in July consumed another 8 months of fighting. The bombing campaign intensified. German cities burned. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of others were reduced to fields of rubble. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Industrial production collapsed. The transportation network disintegrated. Germany was being systematically destroyed, while its leadership insisted that victory was still possible. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even more catastrophic. Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviets on June 23, 1944, destroyed German Army Group Center in a defeat even more devastating than Stalingrad. The Soviets advanced 400 miles in 2 months, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw by August. By January 1945, they had reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Millions died, soldier and civilian alike, in a war that continued only because one man refused to accept reality and surrounded himself with subordinates, too afraid or too loyal to tell him the truth. And yet, remarkably, von Rundstedt's story was not over. In September 1944, with Germany facing invasion from both east and west, Hitler recalled von Rundstedt to command. The old field marshal was brought back to the very position he had been dismissed from, Commander-in-Chief West. Why? Because there was no one else. The competent generals were dead, imprisoned, disgraced, or exhausted. Hitler needed someone with prestige and experience to hold together a crumbling army, someone whose name still commanded respect among the officer corps. Von Rundstedt accepted. He was 69 years old, tired, and suffering from heart problems. He had no illusions about what he could accomplish. He told his staff that his job was to preside over a catastrophe, not to prevent one. The war was lost. Everyone except Hitler knew it. But Germany was still fighting, and soldiers were still dying, and someone had to give the orders, even if those orders could not change the outcome. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. The attack through the Ardennes, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's plan, not von Rundstedt's. The field marshal had opposed it from the beginning. He thought the forces allocated were insufficient for the objectives assigned. He thought the logistical situation made sustained offensive operations impossible. He thought the entire concept was strategically unsound, a gamble that could not succeed and would consume Germany's last reserves. The fuel did not exist to reach Antwerp, the stated objective. The Luftwaffe could not provide sustained air support. Even if the attack broke through, it could not be exploited or sustained. Von Rundstedt proposed a more limited attack, the small solution, that might achieve local success without risking everything. Hitler rejected it. The attack would proceed as he had ordered. The offensive went forward on December 16, 1944, with approximately 30 divisions, the last significant operational reserves Germany possessed. It achieved complete surprise. The Americans were caught unprepared, convinced that Germany no longer had the strength to attack. The front buckled. A bulge 50 miles deep formed in the American lines. Some units were overrun, others fled in panic. For a few days, it seemed that Hitler's gamble might succeed. But von Rundstedt was right about everything that mattered. The offensive ran out of fuel before it reached its objectives. German tanks stood motionless on roads, their fuel tanks empty, easy targets for Allied aircraft once the weather cleared. American resistance at key points, particularly Bastogne, delayed the German advance and disrupted the timetable. When the skies cleared after Christmas, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. The bulge began to shrink. By late January 1945, the Germans were back where they had started, having lost approximately 100,000 casualties and 800 tanks that could never be replaced. The Ardennes offensive had accomplished nothing except to accelerate Germany's defeat by consuming resources that might have prolonged resistance by a few weeks. The Ardennes was the last gasp of German offensive capability. After it failed, there was nothing left but retreat, defense, and eventual surrender. Von Rundstedt knew this. Every officer with any understanding of military reality knew this, but the war continued anyway because one man would not permit it to end. In March 1945, von Rundstedt was dismissed for the final time. American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, crossing the Rhine River intact. It was the first time an enemy army had crossed the Rhine since Napoleon. Hitler needed someone to blame for the failure to destroy the bridge. Von Rundstedt had nothing to do with the decision, nothing to do with the demolition preparations, nothing to do with the failure, but he was the senior commander. He was relieved and replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Von Rundstedt went home to his family. He was 69 years old, exhausted, and seriously ill. He had served Germany for over half a century. He had commanded armies in 3 wars. He had won great victories and overseen terrible defeats. And in the end, he had been proved right about everything that mattered and punished for being right. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Hitler was dead, having shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th as Soviet forces closed in. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. The war in Europe had killed approximately 40 million people, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Germany itself lay in ruins, divided between the victorious powers, its cities destroyed, its population homeless, its future uncertain. Von Rundstedt was captured by American forces of the 36th Infantry Division on May 1, 1945, at a hospital in Bad Tölz, where he was being treated for a serious leg ailment and heart problems. He was held as a prisoner of war and treated with the courtesy due his rank and age. The Americans were uncertain what to do with him. He was clearly a senior commander who had served Hitler throughout the war, but he was also a traditional military officer who had apparently disagreed with many Nazi policies and had been dismissed twice for speaking too honestly. In January 1949, von Rundstedt was charged with war crimes by the British. The primary accusations related to the treatment of prisoners of war and the execution of captured Allied commandos under Hitler's infamous Commando Order, which had directed that all commandos be shot immediately upon capture rather than treated as prisoners of war. Von Rundstedt had transmitted this order to units under his command. Allied commandos had been executed as a result. The trial never happened. Von Rundstedt's health deteriorated so severely that he could not appear in court. The British authorities eventually concluded that prosecuting a dying old man would serve no useful purpose. The charges were dropped. Von Rundstedt was released from custody in May 1949. Von Rundstedt spent his final years in retirement near Celle, a small town in Lower Saxony in the British occupation zone. He lived quietly with his wife, avoiding public attention, giving occasional interviews to military historians who sought his perspective on the war. He generally refused to discuss the Nazi period or his own role in it. When asked about Hitler, he was dismissive but not apologetic. When asked about the war, he was analytical but rarely reflective. He never wrote memoirs. He never published justifications for his actions. He never sought to explain himself to the public or to posterity. Whether this was due to ill health, to stoic reticence, or to an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about his own complicity, no one can say for certain. Gerd von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953, at age 77. He was buried with military honours at Stöcken Cemetery in Hanover. Over 2,000 mourners attended. His grave is marked by a simple stone bearing his name, rank, and dates. It says nothing about his service, his victories, his defeats, or his famous words to Keitel. The question that historians have debated ever since is what von Rundstedt's story tells us about moral responsibility in war and in organizations more generally. Some argue that von Rundstedt was just another general who served a criminal regime, that his aristocratic contempt for Hitler did not prevent him from serving faithfully, that his skill as a soldier enabled atrocities he never personally ordered but certainly facilitated. The war crimes he was charged with were real. The commando order he transmitted led to the deaths of captured Allied soldiers who should have been protected by the laws of war. The campaigns he commanded in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union killed millions. His professional excellence served a criminal regime. Others argue that von Rundstedt represented the tragedy of the professional soldier trapped in a criminal system, that he was not a true believer but a craftsman who served the state without questioning the purposes of his service, that his famous words to Kittel showed a man who understood the truth but could not act on it except through speech. He was trapped, these interpreters suggest, by his own conception of duty, by traditions of obedience that left no room for moral independence, by a lifetime of training that taught him to follow orders rather than to question them. Perhaps both interpretations contain elements of truth. Perhaps von Rundstedt was simultaneously a skilled professional, a passive enabler of evil, a clear-eyed realist, and a moral failure. Human beings contain contradictions. History does not offer simple categories that accommodate the full complexity of individual lives. What is clear is that von Rundstedt saw what was happening more accurately than almost anyone in the German High Command. 25 days after D-Day, he understood that the war was lost beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. He understood that continuing to fight would only increase the destruction. He understood that the only rational course was to seek peace while there was still something left to save, and he was right. Everything that happened afterward confirmed his judgment. The Battle of the Bulge was a futile waste of Germany's last reserves. The defense of the Rhine was a delaying action that bought nothing but time for more destruction. The final defense of Berlin was a bloodbath that served no military purpose whatsoever. Every day the war continued after July 1st, 1944, was a day that cost lives, German and Allied alike, without changing the ultimate outcome by 1 degree. Von Rundstedt saw this clearly. He said so directly. The deeper lesson of his story is about how organizations fail when they punish truth-telling. Hitler's Germany was a system optimized for self-deception. Good news flowed upward through the chain of command. Bad news was filtered, softened, delayed, or blocked entirely. Officers who reported honestly on unfavorable situations were accused of defeatism and replaced by officers who reported what the leadership wanted to hear. The result was a command structure that grew progressively more disconnected from reality, making decisions based on fantasies rather than facts. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history and throughout human organizations. Corporations that punish managers for honest assessments of problems, governments that promote officials who agree with established policy and marginalize those who question it, militaries that silence officers who challenge accepted doctrine. In every case, the short-term comfort of conformity creates long-term catastrophe when reality finally imposes itself. The people at the top of such organizations make decisions based on information that has been optimized for their psychological comfort rather than for accuracy. They come to believe their own propaganda because everyone around them confirms it. And by the time they realize the truth, when reality becomes impossible to deny, it is too late to change course. The damage has been done. The opportunity for correction has passed. Von Rundstedt's words, "End the war, you idiots," were not merely an assessment of Germany's military situation in July 1944. They were an indictment of a system that had made honest assessment impossible. They were a statement that the men in charge had lost the ability to see what anyone with functioning eyes could see. They were a cry of frustration from a professional who had spent his entire life mastering a demanding craft, only to watch that craft destroyed by amateurs who believed that will could substitute for reality and faith could overcome arithmetic. The fools did not end the war. They continued fighting for 10 more months. They presided over the destruction of their own country. They sent hundreds of thousands of young men to die in battles that could not be won for objectives that could not be achieved. And when it was finally over, when the ruins were still smoking and the dead were still being counted, the survivors asked how it had happened, how a nation of educated people had followed a madman to complete destruction. Part of the answer is that the people who knew the truth, the people who could see clearly, the people who dared to speak honestly, were systematically removed. They were dismissed, arrested, executed, or driven to suicide. And the people who replaced them told comfortable lies until there was nothing left to lie about, until the enemy was in the streets and the Reich Chancellery was burning. Von Rundstedt saw the end coming 25 days after D-Day. He said so plainly. He was removed for his honesty, and Germany burned for another 10 months because no one in power could bear to hear what he had to say. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten moments from the Second World War with a wider audience. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each story matters. Each story deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations. From veterans to history enthusiasts, from students to scholars, you are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.